unfortunately over our Zoom link, but this is the way of webinars nowadays. So we've got a session this morning for you on reconciling growth with net zero. So it's a really live topic at the moment with COP26 going on, and definitely something that with the IED are really keen to engage with all of our members, but also wider partners and those who are involved in meeting some of these challenging issues that we're suffering at the moment. This morning I have with me Andy Hulme, who's the Head of Innovation Growth at Northwest Business Leadership Team. And I'll come to Andy in a minute for him to introduce himself and tell you a bit about what he's doing. And we've also got Bev Hindle, who is the Executive Director of the Oxford to Cambridgeshire ARC. And my name is Paul Frainer, so I'm a director at the IED, but in my substantive day job, I'm also Assistant Director of Strategy and Economy at Cambridge City Council and South Cambridgeshire District Councils. So I think without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Andy, who will open up. What we'll do is we'll have a few questions. There are obviously quite a few of you here today, so please put your questions into the Q&A. If you've got them all the way through, we'll have a little chat this morning. I have got a bit of a short interactive session to try and get you guys involved a little bit and get your thoughts on some of the issues that we're discussing. But yeah, there's no chat function, but use the Q&A and please add questions in and we'll try and pick them up as we go through the session. So firstly, I'm going to hand over to Andy. He can give you a bit of an introduction to himself and what he's been up to.
Well, hi everybody. So as Paul says, my name's Andy Hulme. I'm Head of Innovation and Growth at Northwest Business Leadership Team. BLT was formed over 30 years ago by a group of leaders who recognised the need for business to step up and work with public sector partners to make a difference. And as a group, our members span nearly all sectors of the economy, from professional and financial services through to advanced manufacturing. So working for an organisation that was established to harness the power of business to deliver sustainable prosperity in the Northwest, you'll be in no way surprised that I approach this question very much from the business perspective. In considering how we reconcile growth with net zero, we have to remind ourselves that, and others, that business is a key part of society and the community, and as such, they need a voice and have the right to an opinion. And that's not always easy at the moment, as business is seen in some quarters as a problem, or even the enemy. And business is only part of the growth story in any given place and economy. Businesses come in many different shapes and sizes, from sole traders working out of a garden shed or spare bedroom to big global corporations, but mostly they're somewhere in between. Most are trying to get by, and if they can, do the right thing in the process. Regardless of their size, I'd argue that successful businesses need three core things: a clear purpose and the skills and resources to deliver on that purpose. From a resources point of view, that means access to finance and generating profits, which has to mean growth. Similarly, to attract the wisest and best talent, business has to increasingly demonstrate not only positive purpose and values, but also opportunity for its workforce, which again is linked to growth. A growing business presents opportunities for personal development and growth for its staff. Not growing is not an option. Not growing is standing still whilst all around it keeps moving, and that includes costs from a business perspective. Not growing means not having the money to deliver against purpose. How we want the economy to grow is a different question. Now, increasingly, businesses are being scrutinised from both ends of the spectrum. So investors and funders at one end, wanting assurance that the business's activities are positive and not harmful to society, the environment, or by association reputation. At the other end of the spectrum, from the customer and the consumer, who are increasingly exercising choice based on a wider set of values than cost alone. Now, this scrutiny is part of what's driving the requirement on larger businesses to report on ESG, so environment, sustainability and governance, as part of their annual reporting cycle. Increasingly, businesses will have to think more proactively about how they reconcile their growth ambitions with the net zero agenda. That's in terms of operation, process, products and waste. And they also need to assess what the negative impacts of climate change might be on their own businesses as well as part of their reporting process. They need a plan for achieving net zero, and one that's robust enough to satisfy funders and shareholders and their customers, whether that be business to business or business to consumer. And whilst at the moment much of this relates to larger businesses, banks and other funders are progressively lowering the threshold for the size of businesses to which these requirements will apply. So within the next 3 or 4 years, pretty much any business seeking funding from a mainstream source like a bank will have to monitor and report on their environmental impact and sustainability. That's a big change. To be fair, there are a number of great examples of how businesses, including many energy-intensive industries and the waste sector, are working collaboratively to drive forward plans for decarbonisation and achieving net zero. Globally, think of brands like IKEA. Here in the Northwest, this includes activities of Net Zero Northwest, an industry-led cluster acting as a public-private sector investment accelerator for industrial decarbonisation and clean growth projects in the region. It unites business, regional leaders and academia, and is committed to delivering a coordinated net zero vision for the region. Now, for Net Zero Northwest, in delivering on their mission, and for the rest of us in achieving net zero more widely and in the UK and globally, there will be challenges, including how the cost of transition is shared between business and consumers. The pace of change will be another challenge for many businesses, partly because of the focus brought by COP26 and partly driven by many people reevaluating what matters to them in the aftermath of the COVID pandemic. Lots of people want change. They want a better world, they want a more equitable society, and they want it now. Now, you all work in economic development. You all know how long it can take to move an investment from initial concept through to a full business case and approvals and on to funding and delivery. Major industrial and infrastructure investments take even longer. So I don't need to tell you that change takes time, and there needs to be a degree of honesty and pragmatism in the way we approach this with communities about how quickly positive change can and will happen. We can and are starting to make positive changes now. Indeed, many of the businesses that NWBLT counts as members have been doing more than just talk about sustainability and net zero for some time. But for certain sectors and industry that will need to find hundreds of millions of pounds of investment to achieve net zero, seeing tangible change will take time. But there are huge green economic opportunities too, through identifying and plugging gaps in supply chains, supply chain capacity, capability, the adoption of digital technologies, and supporting innovation in new materials and processes, and in improving opportunities for people to develop and learn new skills. So building a stronger circular economy, I think, will be key to this, along with a better recognition of the role of natural environment in helping mitigate and offset residual emissions. So to conclude, we can keep growing, and in ways that don't cost the earth, to coin a phrase, but it won't happen overnight. Thank you.
Andy, thanks very much. That's really interesting, and it's already stimulated my thoughts as I'm busy here writing out little post-it notes of things that I'm going to want to pick up with you as we go through the panel. Thanks very much. Bev, I'm going to hand over to you now to give yourself an introduction as well, please.
Paul, thank you, and thanks, Andy, for that. Good morning, everyone. My name is Bev Hindle. I'm the Executive Director of the Oxford to Cambridge ARC Leadership Group. That's a group of most of the local authorities, LEPs, across the ARC, working very closely in a co-sponsored project, working with government to sort of build this ARC narrative in terms of sustainable and sustained economic growth that is clean, green, and inclusive. And what's really important, I think, and I'm really glad Andy gave that kind of an introduction to this process, because I think for us, one of the really things that we struggle with the public's idea is that growth can be good. Growth has such a negative connotation to it. And yet, inevitably, growth is something we need to do as a species, as a planet. But the reality is it's got a connotation, and it can do, can't it, that growth can be bad and it can be done badly. And I think one of the things we're trying to do at scale is change that narrative around to where actually, while people want to argue about how much growth, and they will always argue about how much growth or too much growth, what we need to be talking about whatever growth is coming, because growth can be good for us as a civilization, needs to be positive, needs to be contributing to our as a very basic instinct to our survival, but hopefully we can thrive off of the back of that good growth. And I think for us, so defining and setting out the terms of good growth is very important, as Andy has said, and making sure that our businesses are recognized as being a fundamental part of that. We did a piece of work when I was strategic director at Oxfordshire County Council a while back, trying to not try to put in a box, but try to contextualize the idea of negative growth. And the reality is, most people want to change the key contributors to growth. They want less population, or they want less houses built in their neighborhood, or they want less sort of congestion. They want the things that growth seems to exemplify them to stop. But the reality is, be careful. We all want those things to be managed better. But if you talk about canceling or slowing down or creating negative growth, you're really starting to upset the economic models we base our society on. Now, we could have a separate conversation about whether those models should change. Absolutely right. But the reality is, be very, very careful about what you're wishing for here. And let's try to be a little bit more intelligent about what we want to manage better, as opposed to what we actually want to stop. And so for me, there's 4 or 5 areas, I think the ARC in particular, but me generally thinking about where you can reconcile this sort of, good growth or the idea that growth can fit with a carbon zero future. And the ARC actually does quite well across all of these. So for instance, using growth to change market conditions, using the idea that, wait a second, at scale, doing the right thing can actually create favorable market conditions to be able to make that a more effective, a more affordable, a more accessible type of technology or innovation. Simply, it could be behind what the government are trying to do around boilers and heat pumps, but think about this idea that new growth can actually create those markets that then can be retrospectively or retroactively fitting and retrofitting our society as a whole. So it's not just about the new growth; it actually can benefit those of us who are here now, and that's a big theme from the leadership group I work for. They're fine to work in a strategic space for the longer term, but let's be honest, they work in very short-term political cycles, and they need to answer to people who are here now. So the market can lead change that benefits us now. And I believe that can be reconciled very cleanly if we start to focus to what those absolute targets should be. And that leads into my second point, really, which is about being bold and being ambitious about setting proper targets, proper legal limits where we absolutely have to meet those within a certain time frame. And not tomorrow, maybe not the next day, but let's do that graduated progress so we can all see what our pathway is to 2050 or 2040 or 2035, whatever time limit we're setting. But by doing that, you're setting the conditionality for the market to respond and for us to respond. And with all due respect to all of us, I'm not suggesting we're all sheep by any stretch, but the reality is sometimes we do need a target and we do need something to hit for. Otherwise, we might not change. So requiring change, and we're seeing that around electric cars. We're seeing the kind of change that's created in the market, one that was slowly dynamically building, but now with very real limits and very real targets coming forward, possibly we could do even with a bit harder over time. We are starting to see massive investment beyond even the positive investments happening in that sector. And that's really good for us because I think that's really important, but not just to set those targets, but to actually hold us to account to meet those targets. And if we're not meeting those targets, take the necessary actions to do so. I think I come from a local government background, so I wouldn't be doing my job if I wasn't saying there wasn't more investment needed. Of course, there's more investment needed, but I think that comes from both the private and the public sector, and investment in the right things. Okay, so I don't sponsor an economic model that's built off taxing the things that are bad for us. The reality is we shouldn't be taxing and requiring big revenues from smoking or petrol, fossil fuels, because the reality is that's not good for our long-term health and well-being, and ultimately, creates an economic model that's not sustainable. So what we really need to do is put that investment where good growth and good ideas are coming, and drive that innovation economy, drive that new ideas of what can actually come out of. And we, in the ARC, probably as well as anywhere in the world, but I think the UK as a whole, we've got that entrepreneurial spirit, we've got that innovative spirit, we've led this space on many sectors. Let's continue to be bold and set those targets to be able to allow us to continue to do that. And I think aligned to that, where government can really help, not just in setting targets or regulation, but actually in creating the conditions for a living lab type of setup. Now, I know that's a bit of a cliche, but the reality of learning that we have to fail sometimes to advance, testing things to be able to product and commercialize, but let's not just stop there, not just for ourselves and deriving our own domestic market, but a global market, which then in turn creates a really positive economic return. But doing the right things, heading towards carbon zero, manufacturing clean, green economic output will actually solve our problems, but while it's solving the planet's problems. That's a perfect marriage. So I think that's a perfect reconciliation of growth and carbon zero. And I'll give you a really good example. And I think part of what we do on that living lab journey is there are certain outputs we have to aim for, but it's always the journey. You know, it's the inventing duct tape while you're trying to go to space sort of you know, urban legend. But I think I was talking to somebody this week, a fantastic concept, this idea of harvesting solar energy from space and beaming it back down onto Earth and into the sea, and then cabling it into our domestic markets. I mean, it seems like something out of the Avengers or something out of a cartoon. But when talking to the group that's put this group together, this idea together, it's a consortium of over 30, including NASA and several big energy suppliers. So it's got legs. But what they were telling me is that's our goal. But you can absolutely be certain on the direction towards that sustainable energy supply, we will invent and create many, many things that drives economic renewal, recovery, and positive growth, all with the right ambition and the right outcome in mind. Last thing I'd want to say is it's really fundamental not to just think just strategically about these things. It's also about how we can help our communities along the way as well. And this is where I think there's a real disconnect around the positive benefits of growth to our places. We don't have the best alignment, certainly in this part of the country, between what the skills we require in terms of driving that innovative, green, clean, inclusive growth. But we have areas that actually are demanding and needing a better share of the prosperity pie. And so aligning those skills to drive that innovative growth, I think, is fundamental. And I know this is a broken record. We've talked about this a lot, but there is something fundamentally not wrong when we're churning out graduates of a high degree who are not actually capable of entering into the business world, which is driving the apprenticeship schemes, which is driving a lot of what business wants, which are actually people who can apply themselves. So if we can get those apprenticeships and those skills based in those clean, green growth areas and actually work with business to support business, small business, medium-sized business, big business, to be innovative and change, then I think we're under a real winner there. And that's the kind of positive outcome from growth that we could all sort of live by. And all of these points I've made really sum up where we're trying to go with the green arc, with this idea that, yes, we want environmental improvement, but what we want to do is improve society overall in a more sustainable way. And that means a strong economy, that means a strong, healthy environment, and it absolutely means better social outcomes. So, Paul, I think we absolutely can reconcile those two things. We've got some work to do to convince the public of it sometimes, but I absolutely believe we can do it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I completely agree with many of the things that you talk about there, really, in terms of, you know, growth and, you know, the way that it's perceived at the moment. But essentially, you know, when we talk about growth, we mean lots of different things a lot of the time. You know, naturally, as a population, we're growing all the time, and how do we facilitate that in a way that's sustainable is something that occupies my thoughts a lot. So I'm just going to give you a quick overview of my world a little bit now at the moment, and I haven't seen any questions coming in yet, but be really pleased to start getting some to come through. I mean, you've heard from Andy and you've heard from Bev and the work that they're doing at the moment. You know the kind of the scope of the session. I'm nothing off the table really. I think here it's a really interesting start. I've spoken at a couple of conferences in the last probably 2 or 3 weeks on zero carbon. It's really growing in terms of its the conversations going on around it. So please put some questions into the chat and we'll start picking them up. So I suppose I'm not going to be quite as exciting as beaming down energy from space. That's not quite as exciting from my perspective, but you know, I deal with land use planning, and I mean, land use planning has got such a crucial role in both of those, both reconciling growth and ensuring that we meet net zero carbon. And obviously Bev and I know each other because, you know, the areas that I work in are on one side of the arc. You know, we're under pressure at the moment to ensure that we provide adequate development and outline a positive framework for development over the next few years, but also under the brush of the fact that we have to do that by meeting, you know, some stringent targets. And I do think, you know, I agree wholeheartedly with Bev that there needs to be clear and, you know, tangible targets that are set and that people understand how they meet them. And you know, some of the things that we're trying to look at the moment in Cambridge is how and where we place houses, development, jobs. You know, that's a critical element. It's not just about, you know, heating homes or transitioning organizations to, you know, to being known at output. It's about where things are placed. You know, we do a lot of traveling. We need to reduce the amount of unnecessary traveling. I mean, we've just seen with COVID, and you know, what is it, 18 months probably of remote working. I mean, I'm still working from home at the moment. I've traveled probably 90% less than I have in the last 18 months than I did in the previous years. So, you know, it's not beyond the wit of us all to figure that actually some of these things aren't that necessary. Yes, we do want to see people, and we want to have some, some social kind of elements to our lives, but the way that we place stuff is really important. And land use and planning has such a critical role, because it's not just concerned with those buildings and the net outputs of carbon in those buildings and places, it's concerned with place making. So it has really the potential to be a very powerful tool. And it is also one of the things from the market perspective that also gives some certainty. Land use plans are, incredibly dry and boring, and I hope none of my policy planners are listening into this webinar this morning, but it can be very boring, but actually it affects almost every single part of everybody's lives, and essentially gives certainty to the development, gives certainty to businesses, or gives more certainty, because it's a statutory tool in how we deliver growth, where we put stuff, and how we feel about we're going to transition into that net zero. So I think it's a really crucial thing, and unfortunately, as Bev has mentioned, I'm also in local government. We have had poor funding over the last few years, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be using the last 18 months to catalyze the changes that have been good and think about them positively, especially in with some of the big challenges. It seems like everything's come at one time, hasn't it? But with that, I think that there are huge opportunities. So I'm starting to see some questions coming through now. So I'm going to answer a few of these, because I think I want you guys to get involved, and we have got a bit of interaction as well coming forward with these in a minute. So let's pick up a couple of questions as we're seeing them come through. I won't mention names, but please feel free if you want to mention your name yourself. So question here: innovation is clearly a part of decoupling carbon from growth. How do we ensure that these solutions aren't only affordable by the wealthier, high growth areas, which exacerbate inequalities between places? So Andy, I'm going to come over to you with this one.
Good question. That connection sort of between net zero and place, and business and industry and place, and transport and place, and innovation is a really interesting one. I don't think we've necessarily cracked it yet, but a lot of the innovation that needs to take place, I think, is a sort of regional and national scale, in terms of some of the networks and the key infrastructure that we rely on. And that's something that hopefully supports and benefits all places. I know there's the risk of getting into a bit of an argument between different levels of things spent on things like transport and innovation in transport spend across the country. I think there's a question of how we stimulate innovation in different places. How innovation is something that comes from within a place, within a community, that people who have ideas of how things could be better and how they can change, how do we support them to do that? So that innovation, where possible, is something that's done with people and not to people. Because I think there's also then, if people think that we're just making stuff up and inventing stuff and creating stuff just to, from a business perspective, to make money, which to some extent businesses are doing that to make money, it comes back to the purpose point, why they're making money. Most of the businesses we work with are trying to demonstrate responsible business leadership, both for their business, their employees, and the places where they operate. I'm not sure I'm entirely answering this question, Paul.
That's fine, Andy.
It's a tricky one.
It's difficult. It is a tricky one, and I think one of the things I think Bev mentioned in his intro is the changing demand will stimulate innovation, and I think that's it's important just on my perspective, and Bev, you might want to come in on this, is that actually, I feel personally that in my own roles, we have a real responsibility to set out what it is that we require, so we can, with the market, can see what those changes are happening and can organise themselves, appropriately for that changing demand. And we have an opportunity to shape that innovation ourselves. The public sector is, a lot of the time where innovation comes from, but then is delivered by the private sector. And I think that is something that we need to get closer at co-designing. And if there's any thoughts from you on that, Bev?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things. I see some of the other questions. I'll try and pick up a little bit of a side bit too as well. I think, look, I'm not an economist by background at all, but what I do understand is sometimes you do need early adopters who are going to pay more money for certain technology, and then the rest of us can afford it afterwards once it becomes more scalable. I mean, I'm not trying to say that's a good idea. I'm just saying that seems to be a pretty tried and true method of launching and releasing technology. So I think there is a market stimulation that is required, I'm afraid, by those who probably have more than less, or there is an opportunity or there's a need for government to help provide subsidy. But I got to also admit that hasn't always gone well, because quite often what we just see is a change in the supply dynamics or the cost dynamics because government offers subsidy. So I think there is, unfortunately, a link to it will probably happen in those places. And that's one of the things we've tried to say about the ARC, and we've tried to say about successful places is, look, that you kind of have a responsibility to be early adopters in some of this and take on that mantra of trying something different here, because the rest of the country and the rest of the world is going to require that. And I think to a certain extent, if you want to take that to a global extent, first world countries are going to have to get their act together, because not only are they the ones who can afford to do something different and drive technology, they're also the worst users. And I think there is a relationship between those two things. So I do think demand pricing, user pays, some of these are principles that are going to have to still apply to be able to soften that buffer of technology. I think the other thing is, somebody raised a question about, I think there is something wrong with GDP. I think there is something wrong with some of the measures we use now. I think we have to think about productivity and prosperity in different ways. I mean, we've been advocates, there needs to be a far greater understanding of, are we actually happy? Are we healthy? Are we thriving? There are other indicators of success that isn't just simply a monetary one, because if money isn't distributed in the right way, it can still hide a lot of problems. So I think it's too simple. I'm not saying it's a useless statistic. I'm just simply saying it's not the only statistic. So I think the holding us to account over a wider set of measures. And somebody asked, well, how do we do that? Well, first of all, we got to start reporting and openly, publicly, we got away from that. I was probably one of the people that loved the fact that we stopped doing that, because it made my working life a lot easier. But actually, it moved you away from accountability, and then it becomes anecdotal. Well, of course we're fine. Look at this. Well, hold on. Where's the measure? Where's the evidence? So I think we do have to return to some really nerdy stuff here. But what is the evidence telling us? And then make sure that we're pressing decision makers to be evidence-led in their decision making. And I do think there is a link between setting a right target, getting the right measure, being held to account, and then doing something about it. And just, Paul, before I sort of exhaust myself on the platform, I'm really struck, and every audience I talk to, I try to get them to look at the Welsh Future Generations Commissioner. And I'm not saying that's a perfect model, but I think what's interesting about the model they use is the government has put them in place to monitor the UN sustainability goals and hold people to account in major procurement and major infrastructure investment. And is this actually delivering against what we said it was supposed to do? I do think those are incredibly helpful organizations and tools to help remind ourselves, not just government, not just local government, private sector, major consortiums. Look, this is public money, this is public interest, this is public outcomes that we're driving here. We all need to be held to account to be driving a different outcome. So I think that accountability is real, but I think we have to follow through. That's the difference. We haven't been following through. In some cases, we haven't even been measuring.
Thank you very much, Bev. That's a really helpful and comprehensive kind of thoughts on that. And I think just leading into that on the point of GDP, and I know that you mentioned in your introduction around, there is a separate conversation to be had whether the current economic models, are fit for purpose in 2021. I'm pretty sure that most people would say that it's questionable if they are, and there needs to be some thought around that. I mean, there's a really interesting point here. I'm going to read out the whole question because it's actually very relevant. It's asking a question to us. So with modern economies increasingly less predicated on products and materials and more on services, which are increasingly intangible, we can arguably continue to have intangible economic growth, which uses more material but at a decreasing pace, i.e. we could get to sustainability that would not increase our material footprint on the planet but still increase economic value, particularly if we start measuring moving away from those crude measures like GDP. Would we agree as a panel? And I think I do agree. And one of the things for me, and it's slightly outside of my current area of work, is around, we also find ourselves in the middle, in my view, of probably the fourth industrial revolution in terms of technology and digital, and the move to datafication of everything, and that slow shift from products to services is really positive in the fact that the previous kind of economic values took natural resources and turned them into economic development, whereas actually now the model is shifting from the use of data and the use of services as that economic. So we do need to really revisit, in my view, the set of measures that we judge ourselves on, and that we judge our output on, and their productivity is absolutely a part of that. But I tend to agree. So Andy, what do you think about that statement?
Possibly a little controversially, I don't entirely agree with it. Question: do we want to become a country that moves away from making things? People, I think, forget how important manufacturing still is to the UK economy and how much value it adds. I know this comes back into the argument around GDP and TVA, but in terms of providing high value, high quality jobs, manufacturing is a really good source of those. And Northwest Business Leadership Team, manufacturing over a quarter of the Northwest economy, employs hundreds of thousands of people. And there are real opportunities for manufacturing as we move into a net zero economy, in terms of new materials, in terms of electric vehicles, in terms of the whole supply chain around that. And so, I for one, am not going to sort of, quietly sit back and let manufacturing sort of slip away, because we'll still require the products. They'll still be made somewhere, which then takes us into the whole question of where we source them from and how ethical that production activity is if it's not taking place in the UK. I do agree around the whole fallibility of GDP as a measure. And I think at the national level, in terms of providing a measure for understanding the ability of a country to pay its way, meet its needs, meet the needs of its population, that's fine. But when it starts getting down to places, it does become less and less meaningful. And as Bev was saying, those other measures around actually how well a place is doing and the quality of that place, it's much, much, much more than just, we generated £30 billion of GVA in the last 12 months, because it means nothing to people anyway.
Paul, can I just come in on the back of that? Is that okay? One of the things I think I couldn't agree with Andy more about manufacturing. I think one of the things that I'm hoping COVID has taught us is that we do need to do and produce more things closer to hand. I think, if we're going to aid resilience and we're going to create a more sustainable environment and planet, then stop relying on technology to be invented here, ironically, and then produced halfway around the world, and then shipped back to us at 10 times the price. I think that's, I'm oversimplifying, but I was really struck recently. I went to a renewable energy park in a place called Chelveston up in Northamptonshire. A fascinating site if you ever get the chance to look at it. But talking to the owner, it's an entrepreneur who's driving that place, and it's amazing what they're producing there. But he literally cannot get the quantity of solar panels he's looking for from a domestic market. That just seems crazy when we know as a domestic market, we need millions of these things. So we're either getting them from Germany or from China. And the reality is our relationship with Europe has changed. So the reality is you're looking at a really suppressed and compressed market. That doesn't make sense to me at all. I think even more closer to home, it's things like agri-tech. Rural economy needs to get, we just need to get a little bit more woke on this, because the reality is we should be producing good quality food here, which we do, but we should be consuming it here, and we should be as close to home as possible, because that's part of our sustainability story. But there may be a really cool way of doing it. Agri-tech's a big science area. Vertical farming is a big, huge emerging area. So I think we probably could have produced enough food before, horizontally, but imagine the capability if we do it vertically. So I think there's still room for the sort of sexy innovation part, but just doing the right things, as close to home as possible. And that's about manufacturing, that's about craftsmanship, it's about returning to economy. The other thing, just to quickly touch on, something you said that really struck a chord with me, Andy. We tend to think of high value jobs as the sort of optimum outcome. The reality is, for people to be happy and successful, it's not always about high value jobs. It might be actually they just want to live in a nice community and feel safe and healthy. And so there should be other qualitative measures. High value is important, as you said, as a measure of a company's success or a country's success. But I think we also need these other measures about job satisfaction, about the quality of life that make people actually happy to be craftsmen or tradesmen or delivery people or part of us, or planners like I am, to be say, look, this is what I'm happy in my life. I just want a good quality life. And I think that's where one measure over another one isn't right, but a suite of measures to get that health check across things is really, really fundamental going forward.
Yeah, definitely, really agree, and it's good to get your thoughts on that as well, Andy, because we don't always see it from where we're sitting, around some of that products and services. But the one thing that comes to my mind, in terms of an additional side to that is we have a real skill shortage in many aspects of delivering some of the technology that is going to help us transition as well. And I think that's an area that we can stimulate by you're right, the products still exist. It's just the way that we engage with those products is slightly different. Instead of buying them, we might have them as a service essentially. But yeah, it's a really interesting point. Now, so we've got a few more questions to go through, and then I'm going to try and run a quick interactive session. There's three here that kind of aligned anyway. So is how best local authorities should structure themselves to respond to this agenda, as economic development is not always seen as much as a priority as housing, health and well-being. And I'm going to pick the second question up there as well, is what's our thoughts on specific positive actions local authorities should be taking as a contribution to achieving net zero, both businesses and through its regulatory roles. So I'll start it off, but I'm interested to come to you both on this as well. I mean, from my perspective, local authorities, and I don't think there's any doubt in this, we aren't structured in the best way to deal with 21st century problems. Okay, we know this. We're historical organisations. There's lots of good people wanting to do good things, but the way that we are structured is not to work in this manner. I think one of the things that's important is to really communicate the picture that actually medium and long-term view is absolutely critical to doing this. We take a short-term view so often in councils because it's easy to say it's either placemaking or an immediate housing issue. Now, that immediate housing issue is a problem, but it's being created in the past by poor attention to medium-term planning at a place level. And I think that that's a really important point, is that you cannot get away from the fact that if you don't have good policy and strategy in place, the services and transactions are problematic because you're creating that failure demand in those authorities. So do you think there's opportunities to rethink the way that authorities are working? Certainly. And I think most of the authorities I know, and I sit on the local government association climate advisory board, and a lot of authorities doing hugely good things in that space. There's a lot of focus on climate. Most authorities have got climate change officers. I think they really do need to link that with economic development functions. And I really strongly think that it's such an important part of how we, Bev talked about community. It's not just about business, it's about that bottom-up understanding of behaviour change. And I totally agree. I think that there should be a real focus on what the medium-term opportunities are for councils to engage climate and embed it with how they deliver on economic development, because they need that growth, they need that increase in that prosperity and wealth across their services as well, because they need that sustainability. Andy, Bev, any thoughts?
Yeah, a few. I think it comes, one of the things that local authorities do really, really well on the whole is act as that vehicle for engagement with local communities to actually have the conversations. But starting to refocus those conversations, as you say, Paul, on what medium to long-term growth looks like. I guess picking up Bev's point earlier on in terms of where that growth is and what kind of growth happens, but then conversations around how those communities are linked in to those opportunities in a sustainable way. So, let's not stick growth 15 miles down a dual carriageway away from the majority of populated areas, so everyone has to drive, for instance. I'd also say, in terms of having those conversations, don't forget, coming back to my opening remarks, business is part of that community as well. So, understanding their aspirations, their ambitions for growth, but then how that links back to the people that they need, and how then the system can wrap around that to make sure that business is getting the skills, the talent that it needs from local communities, but then perhaps councils operating as conveners to. There were a couple of instances in my previous job. I used to work at a local enterprise partnership for Cheshire and Warrington, which is a not dissimilar to sort of Oxford, Cambridge in terms of built up areas, large rural communities as well. But a lot of the economic activity happens outside of the urban area. So getting people from where they live to where they work was always difficult. And employers on their own couldn't necessarily afford the solutions. But actually, a couple of the local authorities had brought a number of employees together who then collectively chipped into a pot to put shuttle buses and things on from the nearest railway station. So actually that then becomes affordable. So I think helping to facilitate some of those conversations as well. The last point I would make is, and I know this isn't easy to do, is for local authorities as planning authorities to stand a little bit firmer around things like district heat networks, particularly when it comes to new housing developments. Again, it's less of an issue in some parts of the country, but in those, thinking back to the question earlier on about more disadvantaged communities, it's too easy for developers to argue away environmental measures and sustainability measures on cost. So we need to find a way of addressing that and challenging that, I think.
Paul, just quickly, a couple of thoughts, because I think you guys covered most of it. Absolutely agree with you, Paul, that economic development has to be embedded in these things. It's not, it should, we got to stop these silos and stop. Economic development is down the hall on the right. No, economic development is purely through all of the things we're trying to do here. That's the point of embedding green principles into our economy, is so that these aren't seen as different, or in some cases like negative or competing effects. And that's what I really worry about economic development. It's just seen as a bad thing, but environment's a good thing. And actually, no, they need to be thought of together. Really, there's a question about the MPPF or MPF. Look, the reality is it's not good enough across a lot of subject matter. We could have several hours on that. What I am taking some stock and some comfort, though, is in the Environment Bill and in the 25-year plan, we are starting to see things, positive action around net gain, around natural recovery. We've been testing that across the ARC in certain projects with DEFRA, and I really feel that's the right track. I mean, we do need to do more. So we're pushing for 20% biodiversity net gain. That is something that we just need to keep challenging and pushing, because the reality is 10% net gains probably zero. So, in the end, when you start, as Andy says, when you start to make those trade-offs, because of the planning decisions, I think viability is the enemy of the people, because the problem with viability, I'm not saying things shouldn't be viable, of course they should be, but to whose scale? Continuing to build homes that are non-carbon zero compliant is just making the retrofitting problem and the public purse problem worse. I mean, that's just counterintuitive. So we just need, that's where we really need planning, regulations, and policy to change. Last thing, really, really quickly, somebody mentioned about the well-being index. Yeah, there's been a lot of really interesting work I'm really, really keen on around the Carnegie Trust, Wellcome Trust have done, and a few others, looking at this wider definition of well-being. So moving away from the quality of life indicators we said before, which was about a job, about sort of air quality. I'm not saying those aren't important, they are, but let's pick up these more, as Andy was saying, these more community-based sort of measures. Let's bring the church fund sort of temperature gauge back on the church and say, how are we doing against these things, so the public can actually see and own, are we actually delivering the things we're trying to deliver here, and get community empowerment. I don't believe this is a binary choice of top down or bottom up. I think it's got to be both. And that's why I think there is definitely action. And he's absolutely right. Local authorities can help from that bottom up piece convene. It doesn't have the money it used to have. It doesn't have, and we all feel sad for those days, but that's not coming back anytime soon. The reality is we're conveners, we're facilitators, and if we can help that community conversation and get government to pay attention to the power of that community conversation, then I think that's a really positive role local government can play.
Yeah, and I completely agree on a lot of those points. And just one thing I would add, and then I'm gonna go with this interactive session because I think it'd be interesting to get your thoughts. But in terms of the planning policy, yeah, we know that there's a central government policy lags behind local policy a lot of the time. It's aspiration. We've got to drive that. I think the really important thing, and it speaks to Andy's point about once you've got a development plan in place, that's it. You've missed the boat, right? So you're going to be negotiating all the way down the line. You need to do this early. You need to get it into your policies and get those policies into your plans. And that's the main thing. I mean, we're embarking on a local plan at the moment, which is a big beast. It's for two authorities, but we've done the viability work on our carbon policies. There is slack in the system, right? Get it in there. You need to test it. There's a couple of authorities going through and testing now on some of those viability, on some of those policies, on some of zero carbon policies, the network heating, the circular economy policies in there. There are things that you can do within the current framework. Yeah, that we are always going to moan about the things that we can't do, but let's explore what we can do first, and then we can push those barriers further. I think it's really important. There is an absolute necessity for us to really understand what's within our gift at the moment and push it, because there's no better time, in my view. There's no better time because we've all got commitments around this. There is a sixth carbon budget which is embedded in UK legislation. So let's push. So I'm going to quickly, and bear with me because it doesn't always go to plan, but I'm going to bring up a Menti board now. I want to try and get you guys involved in this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to try and get some of your thoughts on this for the last 15 minutes. So let's go for this and tell me if you can see my screen, guys. Does everybody see my screen? So what I really wanted to do is to get a few of your thoughts that we can discuss in the last 15 minutes between the panel. The session really is around how economic development can help, but also how it can accelerate, that transition to a zero carbon economy. So if you're familiar with Menti, then go to www.menti.com, type in that code, and you'll be on the page that we are. If not, you can scan that QR code, that's fine too. What I'll do is, this is the first question, and hopefully you can start, if you start typing them in, we'll be able to see them coming through. And I'm going to ask the panel on this as well. So what do you think, Bev and Andy, happy for you to come in on us. What do you think are the three biggest challenges you have personally at the moment in your own organisations in ensuring that the economic recovery that we need to take place delivers on that net zero target? I'm happy for you to come in and speak, Bev, rather than type into the Menti. We'll wait for some of the other people to get some of their thoughts on that Menti board.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, I guess there's a couple of things immediately come to mind. I think I'm going to steal a little bit of Andy's thunder, if that's okay. I just don't think we have a strong enough story yet that these things are not mutually exclusive. These things are the same, two sides of one coin, I guess is what I'm saying. And because of that, the confidence for the right levels of investment, the confidence for the right level of policy change isn't just quite there. There's good examples of it. There's incremental progress, but as a whole system, I just don't think we've linked these two things close enough together yet. So that's a big problem. There is clearly not enough public investment. I think the idea that we are not thinking about the longer term and investing against that longer term return, I think is wrong. I think we need more of that. And I guess the third thing is ensuring that we don't take a short-termism view to economic recovery. So in other words, we just build back better by going back to what we did before because that's the easiest road to halt. No, some of these are going to be really tough choices. Some of these we can't go back to what we were doing before. We have to stop and slow down and do it differently. And I think that's very difficult for humans to do. I think we just want to go back to the path we know. And I think that's a real challenge for us going forward.
Agree, and I can see behaviour change coming up a couple of times in some of the thoughts that are coming through. So Andy, do you want to come in as well? Maybe touch on some of the thoughts that are coming through from the viewers.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks. I think resistance to change, which is one of the comments that's come through, and I think the sheer scale of change that we have to go in a relative short period of time is a huge challenge. And I think in part that's because until very, very recently, we've been very good at focusing on and telling a story around what the risks are, what the dangers are, what could go wrong, how flooding could increase, and so on and so forth. But in terms of actually being able to tell the story of what a net zero future might look like from a positive perspective and what it might mean in practical terms for people and for communities and for business, we've just not had that. We've not been able to do that very well. I think now, certainly over the last 6 or 9 months, there's been a lot of activity, there's been a lot of shift in terms of taking stuff from conceptual through to actually more tangible, deliverable projects and funded projects. I think as some of those are starting to crystallise, it's going to make it easier for us to explain, well, actually, this is what a hydrogen economy might look like in terms of transport, in terms of industrial emissions. And then these are where the opportunities are, either for working in that space, for developing supply chains to provide the materials and the equipment and the maintenance and the services for some of that activity. But then it's also, well, these are where the gaps are, so this is where the innovation's needed as well. And so it starts to focus that down as well, and it becomes a lot more tractable and tangible.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks, Bev. And I mean, these are great. Actually, do you know what? And I'm sort of thinking on my feet here that actually we'll pick up a lot of these issues that you're putting down here, and it's something that certainly as the IED we can take away and have a look at and see if there's further work to explore here. But actually, in your own teams, Andy, Bev, you can see what people are saying in this space, and I don't think it's any surprise there. I think. The perception, I mean, there's a point around how we perceive growth as well, isn't there? I mean, I'd love to do a session on kind of defining the different types of growth that we talk about interchangeably and what that means. And that's a really interesting one for me. So, the thoughts that you've put down, everybody here, we'll take some of those away and have a think about how we can, use them in some of our, forthcoming webinars. I'm going to go on to the next slide because there's a few questions that I want to pick up at the end as well. So I want to give us a couple of minutes to pick those up. But there is another question I've got for you all. So if you're happy to come over and move to the next question, it's for everybody really, because it's what's the best example of local government working with a partner or partners to tackle the drive for net zero. Now I know from my own experience both in my councils but also working and being part of the local government association board that there's some great stuff going on in councils, but I'm going to give you a specific example from my own perspective. We are, as I said, mentioned to you, moving forward with our local plan, and we've commissioned a really great piece of work on how we get to zero carbon and how we look at land use in its whole scale, and that work has really led to some unbelievably interesting ideas, but also set out some of the ways that we think we're going to start working. And actually, I think everybody knows that no single sector is going to solve this on their own. And I think that it's really important that we further blur some of the boundaries that we have to make sure that we're working across organisations to think and collaborate on some of these big solutions. And actually, the land use planning is a big one for me. Obviously, it's my line of work, but definitely from my perspective, who we get working for us to help model some of this stuff is really. Anything from you? Oh, can you hear me?
Sorry, Paul. Just you go ahead, Andy. You go ahead.
Sorry, yeah, that's fine.
I mean, there's been some really, partly going back to the hydrogen economy, some of the work that Hulme Borough Council has done, working with Liverpool City Region, working with Cheshire and Warrington around, and with the sort of local hydrogen producers, so Innovin, and also the local bus operators in terms of scoping out the potential for hydrogen bus network and how that would work. I think also second one is probably Glass Futures in terms of the work that St Helens have done with the Glass Futures Consortium for their new sort of global research and innovation centre that's going to be built in St Helens, and will hopefully then help decarbonise the glass industry, which is one of those major sort of consumers of energy and producers of CO2. But without local authority support, that really would have had a much harder job.
Yeah, and I noticed the Green Homes grant with a little sad face next to it at the top, which is you know, it just that shows me the disconnect, and the most important thing in collaborating both centrally, locally, and through businesses to understand what is the best way of delivering stuff. You know, I totally agree. Bev, do you want to come in as well?
Paul, I certainly do not want to come across as being cynical or negative, but I think one of the reasons why we struggle to give better examples is because A, there's not enough of them, and B, there's not enough visibility of them. So I know there's a lot of good work going on within local authorities, but it's very isolated, it's very small scale. And I think people have moved on from just signing up to climate statements, but I think the reality is a lot of authorities are sitting trying to figure out, where do I go into this? I don't have a lot of cash. I don't have a lot of resources. So I think we need to drive that partnership. I've been really impressed with some of the work Low Carbon Hub have done in Oxfordshire. It's not locally authority led, but local authority partners are involved in that work around driving a larger community-based solar and other energy schemes to be able to deliver. I've been very impressed with that work. I'm also really impressed, you know, some of the stuff Cornwall's done, you know, in terms of taking a much more aggressive stance to delivering, you know, its own energy supply. So I think we just need more of that. But I think it's a real challenge for local authorities. I think the other thing to mention here is I'm in Oxford today. I haven't been out of the house very much for the last year now, but I'm in Oxford today because I'm attending something called the Billion Ton Drop. I've been very impressed with what the OxLEP and City of Oxford and Oxford University and other partners have been doing around really tackling that or linking up with the innovation economy and what it's doing to actually reduce carbon. Some wonderful stuff around energy accelerators, et cetera. I won't go into the detail, but if you look that up, Billion Ton Drop, you can find more there as well. Cheers.
Thanks very much, Bev. And you know, I think my thought on your first point is that actually one of the biggest problems that I see a lot of the time is that, you know, in local government, we don't talk to each other very often, or we want to reinvent something ourselves. And I think, you know, in honesty, that's just a cultural thing that's always been the case. I do see it changing in some aspects now, but I think it needs to really, I mean, you know, looking externally is probably one of the most important things that we as organizations should be doing now, and we're looking where there's opportunities to build on good practice, to take ideas, to build on those ideas, to create a bigger footprint. And you know, I think that is something that, you know, is incumbent on us. So we've got a couple of minutes left. There are a couple of questions still. One is put the code up again. I hope that you managed to get that, because I didn't see that as it was coming through. So local, and I don't know if that's a spelling or I'm just ignorant what GINI means. Is that something that you guys, either of you two, know about, Bev, Andy? Gini coefficients, more investment in and the use of ONS personal well-being index, and how the results of these correlate with the economic indicators? Are they viable? Could they help?
Yeah, I'm not so aware of the Gini stuff, but I am aware of the ONS and the well-being indicators. And I think those are really good tools. Those are really good sources and stuff that we just need to highlight more. I think, as I said earlier, there's another comment in there about member. I thought what might come up on that word bubble exercise, I still think there's a real problem of leadership, and I'm not being critical of my leaders. I'm not being critical. What I'm saying is there's a mismatch between politicians who have a 3 or a 4 year term being asked to think about what's good for 20 years ahead, when the people that are voting them or not voting for them are living right now and telling them to stop doing things. And there's a real problem there for ability to lead, when actually the voice of the ones who vote, which is unfortunately a very small percentage of the total population, are still not actually enabling them to do that. So there's a problem with the leadership model that I think we're really going to have to help here. So I think members quietly do want to be ambitious, or some of them are even vocally wanting to be ambitious, but their ability to be ambitious is really, really hindered by that short-termism around how politics and democracy works in this country. Not a criticism, just a state of fact, I think.
An absolute fact, Bev, and I'm sure you know my views on that myself. And unless we open up participation in local democracy, and I think that that's a really critical time. It's a whole other conversation. It's a whole other webinar. But opening up local democracy to the broadest range of people who don't currently engage with it is absolutely critical in getting that longer term view and getting a different voice. And I think that that's absolutely crucial, and one thing that we do need to think because it's intrinsically linked to how we, how we address some of these challenges that we've talked about today. And it's 11 o'clock. We've got no more questions left. I mean, I'm going to go to you, Andy, for some closing remarks, if you've got any. But it's been great to have you both here and your thoughts as well. Some great questions coming in.
I mean, just to say thanks for the opportunity to the IED for attending and participating today. It's been a really enjoyable session. Actually, it's given me some food for thought as well, because again, I come at this from a business perspective, but I also need to remember the other perspectives that are around the table as well. So it's good to hear some of those. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. And any last thoughts from you, Bev, before we close up?
Just thank you, Paul. Thank you, IED. Thank you, everybody, for coming out. I think we just, as you said, Paul, we just need to keep talking, need to communicate, and need to share. And exactly as Andy said, we all have our own perspectives. It's great to hear others, and really thankful for the opportunity to be part of this. Cheers.
Totally agree, and it's been great to have you both on the panel. It's been really enjoyable, and thank you all in the audience for having asked some great questions as well. And I think we've got some really good thoughts to come back and have a think about how we continue the dialogue on this and move it into some more tangible kind of outcomes. So hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and it's nice to see you all, and have a great week.